Hello, my name is Jimmy D. Gibson, and in this presentation I'm going to discuss some best practices around security hardening of enterprise network devices. First, I'm going to talk about to which network devices these best practices apply. Then I'll cover some fundamental network device security practices. Next, I'll talk a little about the three functional planes of network devices, as these will provide sort of a framework to categorize the various best practices. Then, of course, I'll cover the security best practices that fall into each of those functional planes, followed by some example attack scenarios that could result if these best practices aren't properly followed. So the security best practices discussed in this presentation concentrate on routers and switches, but many of them also apply to other network devices such as servers, network appliances, and security appliances. Please note that the security practices covered in this presentation are by no means all-inclusive, but are instead really just some of the fundamental yet critical recommendations. So we'll begin by covering some of the fundamental best practices. First, ensure network hardware is purchased from reliable sources such as direct from the manufacturer or authorized resellers in order to avoid the risk of hardware being modified in some way with malicious intent. Next, avoid out-of-date operating systems such as those no longer supported by or provided by the manufacturer. Old operating systems are at risk for new vulnerabilities, and if it's unsupported, the vendor has no plans to patch those vulnerabilities. Next, practice sound configuration management, such as working from network device configuration templates, having a peer review process for configuration changes, and mechanisms to automatically archive current and previous network device configurations. Also, ensure event logging best practices are being followed. Ensure you know what events are being logged. Those events are timestamped properly, and they are being logged to a central redundant system. Next, ensure a AAA framework is in place, and that framework relies on a protocol such as Radius in order to know who is accessing the devices, what they're allowed to do, and when they're doing it. Another thing to keep in mind is to use secure protocols whenever possible. For example, don't use TFTP for file transfers when SCP is an option. And finally, use access control lists. These can be used to filter routes, to filter actual user traffic, and to control management traffic to network devices. Just use them. I want to quickly cover the three functional planes of network devices, which will serve as the basic categories for each of the security best practices. First, the management plane, which is the traffic that is actually targeting the network devices. For example, SSH or SNMP traffic. Next is the control plane, which is comprised of the various protocols running between network devices, such as routing protocols, OSPF, EIGRP, or spanning tree protocols, protocol running on switches. Then there's the data plane, which is really just the actual user data being forwarded by the network switches. So in the management plane, we'll begin with the user access related best practices. For obvious reasons, we want to ensure passwords are not visible in plain text in the device configurations, and instead are being hashed by a secure algorithm before they're stored. Also, a maximum login attempts policy needs to be enforced in order to protect network devices from brute force attacks. Another point to be aware of is the use of tiered privilege levels, so that individuals have the minimum privilege level required to do their job. If they need additional privileges, either permanently or temporarily, they are granted only via an approved process. Next is a good idea to designate an interface on each network device for management of the network device. This can be a logical loopback interface or a physical interface that acts as the source or destination point for SNMP traffic, syslog data, or just SSHing into the device. Speaking of SSHing into the device, it is also a good idea to enforce console session timeouts, to use explicitly configured transport protocols such as allowing SSH only, no telnet, and to use connection and login warning banners. The next area we want to cover in the management plane are unused services. Essentially, you want to disable all unused services. Depending on the network devices, a number of services could be enabled by default, but just a couple of services to key in on are web or HTTP services and device discovery protocols such as Cisco Discovery Protocol or Link Layer Discovery Protocol. Also, SNMP is a mandatory requirement in most enterprise environments, so ensure the community strings are of adequate complexity, and if you have a choice, leverage SNMP version 3 as it provides authentication and encryption capability. Wrapping up the management plane portion of this discussion is Network Time Protocol. We want to ensure some form of NTP client-server authentication is in place, as well as ensuring an explicit trusted time source is configured. This will ensure the validity of timestamps and the accuracy of any time of day restricted services. The control plane section begins with IP ICMP redirects. These allow a router to direct a host to a more suitable gateway router. Since they can be exploited to allow a man-in-the-middle attack, which we will demonstrate in one of the upcoming examples, this feature should typically be disabled on network devices. Next on the list is proxy ARP, which allows two host devices on different subnets to communicate via layer 2 data link protocols as if they were on the same subnet. The router accomplishes this by responding to ARP requests for off-network devices with its own MAC address, assuming it knows how to reach that particular off-network device. This feature should typically be disabled as well, as it can mask server IP misconfigurations and make detection of ARP spoofing attacks more difficult. Rounding out this section is just a word on routing protocols. Routing protocols, including first hop redundancy protocols such as HSRP, should implement a peer or neighbor authentication process using complex hash passwords in order to mitigate the occurrence of rogue network devices such as rogue routers. The data plane section starts with IP source routing, which is a probing mechanism that allows the source host to specify its own path across the network. One would guess this is generally not a good idea, as source routing also allows the discovery of topology information or the ability to bypass security restrictions on the network. This feature should be disabled. Next topic in this plane is the IP directed broadcast feature, which allows an IP broadcast packet to be sent to a remote subnet. This feature should be disabled since it allows the amplification of certain denial of service attacks by allowing a single packet to solicit a response from an entire subnet. Next in the data plane, we're going to cover some features that one may want to enable if available, starting with some form of port security. Port security can allow specified MAC addresses on a particular switch port, or could even require some type of authentication in order to gain data link layer access to the port. It can help mitigate attempts to physically replace an authorized device with a malicious unauthorized device. Next is some form of ARP inspection, such as Cisco's dynamic ARP inspection, which validates IP to MAC relationships of all ARP packets on untrusted ports by using a trusted database logging those relationships. This feature can help mitigate ARP poisoning and associated attacks. Finally, private VLANs, which are a means to further limit data link communication between hosts on the same VLAN, could be used for added protection. Here we have a demonstration of an ICMP redirect related attack. We begin with a two-router network where host 1 and host 2 are on separate subnets, but both routers are acting as potential gateways for host 1, with gateway router 2 being the obvious best choice. So here an attacker has gained some sort of access to or control of gateway router 1. Then the attacker sends a TCP open request to host 1 from gateway router 1, spoofing host 2's IP address as the source of that packet. Of course, host 1 sends a response to the packet, but while host 1 waits for the reply, the attacker sends him an ICMP redirect spoofing gateway router 2's IP address and specifying gateway router 1 as the new best gateway router. Host 1 in turn updates his local routing table with the new gateway information. The end result is a successful man-in-the-middle attack on all traffic from host 1 destined to host 2 as it traverses gateway router 1. Next, we have a quick demonstration of the dangers of IP-directed broadcast. Here we have a network comprised of 4 primary subnets. The attacking host then sends a single packet spoofing host 1 to the broadcast IP address of each of the subnets containing the 500 host machines. With IP-directed broadcast enabled on the router interfaces, all of those host devices receive and process the packet. Then, of course, all the hosts send responses, essentially initiating a denial of service attack on host 1, using only 2 packets to initiate it. Okay, here are my references for this presentation. Here's my contact information. If anyone has any questions, please email me, and thank you for your time.